因为时间有限，所以我就用英文讲，而且有一些外国朋友，所以还有有一些老朋友，我上次去韩国用中文讲这个题目，所以我不要再用中文讲，所以我用英文讲，而且让15分钟左右。OK。So this topic， 然后当然可以用中文提问题。So this topic, it's actually one that is very relevant in China, and to be frank, not so relevant in Western countries, because the question is how to select political leaders. And in Western countries, more or less, the problem has been solved, meaning that no matter what the level of government, from a small community of 100 people to a big country of over 1 billion, like in India, it's assumed that we select political leaders by means of one person, one vote. Now, I don't have time to go into this. I think that's a highly problematic way of selecting leaders. Now, in China, obviously, that's not a big topic other than the local government. The local government is often you have one person, one vote to choose leaders at the level of villages. But beyond that, there's another system. And what is the system? The ideal, anyway, I'm going to call it political meritocracy. 贤能政治. And the ideal of a political meritocracy is that the political system should be arranged with the aim of selecting and promoting leaders with superior ability and virtue. But that immediately gives rise to the question of which abilities and virtues are important, as well as how to measure those abilities and virtues. And I think for any country that aspires to be a political meritocracy, those are really key questions. And in fact, they're widely debated in China. I mean, I've been in Beijing 10 years already, and that's a very, a question that people argue about, reformers of different kinds. So this question has been directly inspired by my experience living and writing in China, especially in Beijing, because before that I was in Hong Kong, where they seem to be obsessed with the Western idea that leaders must be chosen by means of one person, one vote. So this question of political meritocracy, it's not completely foreign to Western philosophy either. I mean, if you think of the most famous book, arguably, in Western political philosophy, it is Plato's Republic, which is really an extended argument for a form of political meritocracy, right? It's decades-long training to select political leaders who are going to be the best possible, intellects and who are morally committed to serving the good. And the question is, how do we do that? Now, everybody in the West who studies philosophy reads that text, but they don't really take this idea of political meritocracy seriously, because there's a kind of consensus, especially after World War II, that there's only one morally legitimate way of choosing leaders, and that is one person, one vote. Now, in China, also the debate on political meritocracy has very deep roots. If you think of the major strands in Chinese political thinking, whether it's Confucianism, Rujia, or legalism, even Fajia, or other strands, also they tend to argue about what are the key qualities of political leaders and how can they best be measured. Now that debate has more or less died out. I mean, of course, in Imperial China, there was an institutional mechanism that was implemented to select and promote such to select leaders, especially, was the examination system, and that is China's great legacy to the rest of the political world. Although in the West, the examination system was implemented to select civil servants who are supposed to implement the decisions of political leaders. Now, in Imperial China, that distinction was never clear. In fact, of course, in principle, the emperor had to select, or had all the political power, but in practice, those who were selected by means of the examination system, and then usually promoted on the basis of performance at lower levels of government, exercised tremendous amount of political power. Now, this whole tradition has been revived the past 30 years in China. You know, the dominant trope in the Western media, and I must say also among academics who study politics, is that there's been no political reform because they define political reform only in terms of moving towards a system of one person, one vote. But if you set aside that assumption, it turns out there's been a tremendous amount of things happening, and the key reform is a gradual, we can call it a re-establishment of a system of political meritocracy where the leaders are selected through examinations, national examinations often, and then promoted on the basis of performance at lower levels of government, which is really exactly the same model that was in traditional China, especially the imperial system, especially from the Song dynasty onwards. Now, this leads to the question, though, which qualities matter? And I'm going to argue that there are three key qualities, as well as we could think of ways of measuring those qualities. And I think those could be used as standards for judging political regress and progress in China, if we're willing to set aside this assumption that there's only one way of selecting leaders, and it's one person, one vote. I mean, actually, it doesn't take a lot of thought, to question that assumption, but somehow it has become almost sacred, in Western countries. I'm from Canada. I grew up with this assumption, and it took literally, decades of living outside of Canada to finally say, wow, let's just set aside that assumption and think of other possibilities, and then a whole new world opens up. And I have a book coming out on that topic next year, which not every person living in Western country will agree with, but nonetheless, it's my effort to make sense of what's happening in China. So what are the key qualities? Well, the first one I'm going to argue, I should say that it depends on the context too, right? I mean, at lower levels of government, what matters is that political leaders have very close relationship with the people, and the people know more or less the moral character of their leaders, so arguably there's a much better case for democracy at lower levels of government. But the higher up you move the level of government, especially in times of peace, the more intellectual ability matters, because the problems become so much more complex, right? I mean, anything above like the level of a big city in China, the problems are huge. Economic, environmental, anything the government does will affect even not just the people there at the time, but future generations, and often people living outside the country. I mean, think of global warming. And the policy issues are so empirically complex. They require knowledge of economics, of international relations, of the kind of psychological biases that inhibit rational decision-making. So we want leaders who have very high levels of intellectual ability. And then the question is, how can we measure that? Well, this is where the traditional examination system, arguably, is the best possible, or let's say, the least bad system. Remember, Winston Churchill said, oh, democracy is a terrible system except for all the others. Well, the same thing could be said about an examination system as a way of selecting leaders with intellectual ability. It's not a foolproof system, but it's the best option among all those available, or the least bad if you want. And it turns out that this examination system also has many advantages. I mean, it allows for blind grading and fairness in the system. It allows for a high degree of social mobility. It allows, too, for limits on the political power of those on top to select leaders. I mean, if a top leader wants to select someone who hasn't passed the examination system, it's pretty hard for that person to get in. Now, how about now in current China? Well, I've looked at some of the examinations to select, I'm going to call them, I mean, it's strange, the translation in Chinese, 公务员考试, like, it's translated officially as examinations for civil servants, but in fact, they're not civil servants because there's no clear distinction. There's no separate track for someone who becomes a civil servant who's supposed to implement the decision of leaders, and a political leader who exercises political power. They're merged. So they're really examinations to select political leaders. Okay, 5 minutes. So, those examination systems are problematic. I think they could be improved a lot, especially by, to be frank, having a bit less of this political stuff that tests knowledge of some of the official ideology, and much more other things, including Confucian content. Intellectual ability is not sufficient, though, because you also want leaders who are very good, who have very high level of social skills. Think of Frederick Delano Roosevelt, who had very high levels of social skills but low intellectual ability, arguably, yet he was very effective, a political leader. So what matters here is that political leaders have the ability to persuade people around them to get things done. And the question is, how do we test for that? Well, here there are different ways of testing it, but arguably performance at lower levels of government is the best way. I mean, if you succeed at lower levels of government, and then you can be promoted higher, it shows that you have a good ability to persuade people. So the question is, what counts as performance? It becomes more complex now, and we also need other factors to test for high levels of social skills. And here social science is helpful. It turns out that social skills, or emotional intelligence, often is called qingshang in Chinese, can be measured. And usually it correlates with age, actually, as well as gender. Women have it more than men. So on those grounds, there's a very strong case for having more elderly people in government, which is China's doing okay with that, but also more women, and China's not doing so well on that. The third virtue, I have 2 minutes left. The third quality is virtue. You want leaders who are at least partly motivated to serving the good rather than serving their own interests. Of course, if they're corrupt, then by definition they're not virtuous. They're using public power to serve their own interests. So then the question is, how do we select people who are committed to serving the public good? And here, again, we have to rely not just on our intuitions, but on social science and history. And it turns out that there's lots of cases, lots of mechanisms in different contexts that are used to select leaders who are committed to the common good. And it turns out, for example, one mechanism used in the American military, and I'm Canadian, I don't like American foreign policy, but arguably they do a good job. The American military is the most meritocratic organization in the US system, arguably. And they select peer review. They ask for peers. How is this person who you work with on a regular basis? Who has the best moral character? Who's willing to sacrifice their lives for the political community? And it turns out it's a much better system than relying on what superiors say or what the subordinates say. So if you use that as a standard, the big problem in China now is that the promotion system, this is not just my view, it's an official view as well, that there's too much reliance on the views of superiors for selecting leaders and not enough reliance on peers. So again, those three qualities are intellectual ability, social skills, and commitment to serving the public good. Out of those, the last one is the most important, because if you have a smart leader who has good social skills but they're immoral, that would be a disaster, worse than having a smarter, less smart one who doesn't have social skills. What really marks out the quality of a good political leader in a meritocracy is that they're above average on all three criteria. Intellectual ability, social skills, and I'll simplify it as virtue. They don't have to be the highest on the scale on any one of those criteria. You might have a religious leader who's higher on virtue, but at least a political leader should be above average on all three of those qualities. And the question is, what are the best mechanisms for selecting such leaders? I think hugely important question, and it's great, to be honest, to be living in China where people talk about this issue. Thank you.